I wasn't looking for hidden infrastructure when I started this. I was studying military architecture. The geometry of star forts had always interested me from a purely structural standpoint. The way the angled bastions eliminated dead zones. The way the pointed walls deflected cannon fire instead of absorbing it. Standard defensive logic. I accepted the standard explanation. The way you accept that traffic lights are red and green because someone decided that once and nobody changed it. You don't question the premise. You just move through it. Then I started measuring not the walls, the angles, specifically the internal angles of the bastions, the points themselves. And what I found wasn't consistent with the defensive explanation at all. The geometry doesn't optimize for deflecting projectiles. It optimizes for something else entirely, something directed downward, inward into the ground beneath the structure itself. Once I saw that, the standard explanation didn't just weaken, it collapsed. And everything I thought I understood about what these structures actually were had to be rebuilt from nothing. There are over 2,000 documented star forts on this planet. Some estimates place the number considerably higher when you include partially demolished examples, those buried under later construction, and those dismissed as natural formations because the geometry eroded over time. They appear on every inhabited continent: North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, built across different centuries, attributed to different cultures, supposedly constructed for different regional military purposes, and yet the geometry is functionally identical. The bastion angles match, the proportions match, the relationship between the outer points and the central courtyard matches with precision that has no business existing if these structures were independently designed by unrelated civilizations solving local military problems. Military historians explain this as convergent engineering, the same logic applied to the same problem, producing the same solution. That explanation would be satisfying if the structures were actually solving a military problem, but they aren't. And once you examine the locations, the defensive narrative begins to unravel before you even reach the underground evidence. Star forts were not built on high ground. This is the first thing that should stop everyone. Military fortifications throughout history universally occupy elevated positions. The high ground advantage is not a theory. It is a foundational principle of pre-artillery and post-artillery fortification alike. You hold the high ground. You control sight lines. You force attackers to charge uphill. Every military tradition on every continent understood this. And yet star forts with remarkable consistency are positioned on flat ground on coastal plains at river confluences in valley floors. Locations that are militarily indefensible by conventional standards. Locations that a competent military engineer would reject in an afternoon. The official response to this is that star forts were transition-era structures designed for a period when artillery changed the calculus of siege warfare, when height mattered less than the geometry of the walls themselves. But this explanation only addresses the wall design. It doesn't explain the positioning. It doesn't explain why you build an expensive, labor-intensive fortification in a location your enemy could dominate with minimal effort. It doesn't explain why the positioning so consistently matches something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with military strategy. The locations match the current maps. Thermoristic currents are real. They're documented. They're the naturally occurring electrical currents that move through the Earth's crust and surface, generated by the interaction between the planet's magnetic field and solar radiation, amplified by geological formations, water tables, and underground mineral deposits. 19th century scientists didn't just theorize about them. They measured them, mapped them, and in the 1870s and 1880s published substantial research suggesting these currents could be harnessed as a usable energy source. The research didn't disappear because it was wrong. It disappeared from mainstream discussion around the same time certain other things disappeared, which will return shortly. When you overlay documented telluric current concentrations with the global distribution of star furs, the correlation is not casual. It is systematic. Fort after fort sits directly on or immediately adjacent to the strongest telluric zones in their respective regions. The Castillo de San Maros in St. Augustine, Florida. Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas. The fortifications of Valletta in Malta. Fort Zou in France. The Venetian fortifications scattered across the eastern Mediterranean. Fort Bordage in the Netherlands. each one positioned not for military dominance of surrounding terrain, but for proximity to specific geological formations beneath them. And here's where the underground evidence stops being theoretical. Excavations beneath star forts have been ongoing for centuries, mostly for mundane reasons: restoration work, water management, structural assessment, archaeological curiosity. The findings are documented individually in regional historical records. They are almost never discussed in aggregate. When you assemble them, they describe something remarkable: extensive underground chamber systems that predate the surface structures in nearly every case examined. Not the ammunition storage, not the powder magazines, not the simple tunnels that military historians acknowledge and explain away. Chambers, multi-level architecturally sophisticated underground chambers with no military function anyone has been willing to formally propose. In the foundations of Fort Monroe in Virginia, excavations in the 1930s uncovered lower chambers that predated the 19th century fort by an estimated 100 to 200 years. The chambers were empty. Their function was not recorded. The documentation was filed, and the inquiry ended. In the Venetian fortifications of Palmanova in Italy, a star fort considered one of the most geometrically perfect examples in Europe. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the early 2000s identified extensive underground structures that do not appear on any official architectural record. When researchers requested access for physical excavation, access was declined. Administrative reasons were given. At Fort Bortange in the Netherlands, locals have described underground passages since the 18th century. The official record acknowledges their existence, but describes them as simple escape routes. The dimensions recorded in original documentation are not consistent with escape routes. They're consistent with rooms. The same pattern appears in Malta and the Canary Islands, in the star fortifications along the northern coast of India. Acknowledged, categorized, not investigated further. What's underground keeps suggesting itself, and the official record keeps changing the subject. Let's talk about what makes economic sense here, because this is where revisionist history becomes not just compelling, but necessary. The 19th century energy economy was built on scarcity: coal, steam, the infrastructure to move coal from where it was extracted to where power was needed. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just a technological shift. It was an economic architecture, a system of ownership, extraction, transportation, and sale that created some of the largest private fortunes in human history. Vanderbilt's railroads weren't incidentally connected to coal. They were inseparable from it. Rockefeller's Standard Oil wasn't competing with coal. It was extending the same model into liquid fuel. Carnegie's steel wasn't separate from the energy economy. It was the physical infrastructure of that economy made solid. The system required one thing above all others to function. It required that energy be scarce, that it could not be produced locally freely from the ground beneath your feet. The entire edifice of 19th and early 20th century industrial capitalism, the fortunes, the railroad networks, the banking structures built on top of those fortunes, none of it survives a world where communities can draw usable energy from telluric currents through properly designed infrastructure embedded in the earth. Not just Rockefeller, not just Carnegie. The entire system of financial control built during that period required energy scarcity, the way a dam requires water. Remove the scarcity, the dam becomes useless overnight. This is not a fringe economic argument. Economists studying the transition from pre-industrial to industrial economies have long noted the deliberate suppression of distributed energy models in favor of centralized extraction models. What they rarely ask is whether the distributed models being suppressed were suppressed because they failed or because they worked. The timing of a suppression is difficult to explain as coincidence. Serious scientific literature on telluric currents as an energy source peaked between 1870 and 1895. Tesla's experiments with ground conduction electricity. Experiments that went well beyond what his official biography typically describes were occurring in the same period. The early electromagnetic research that suggested large-scale grounded structures could function as current amplifiers in distribution nodes was being published in minor journals and dismissed by major ones. After approximately 1910, this research doesn't gradually lose interest. It stops. Researchers in the field don't retire gracefully. Their funding disappears. Their university positions become untenable, and the literature that preceded them gets quietly reclassified from engineering to speculation. The Smithsonian's handling of pre-industrial energy research during this period deserves its own investigation. Several researchers who published on Earth current energy systems submitted their findings to the institution between 1890 and 1915. The submissions are documented. The responses are not. The research was not debated, not refuted, not published. It was received and not heard from again. This is the same institution that managed the disappearance of the giant skeleton reports. The same period, the same silence, the same administrative void where scientific inquiry should have been. And this brings us back to the Starfurs themselves. If these structures were not primarily military, if their positioning corresponds to telluric current concentrations, if the underground chambers beneath them are real but undocumented, if the economic system that emerged in the 19th century required suppression of exactly the kind of distributed ground current energy these structures might have provided, then what are we actually looking at? We are potentially looking at infrastructure, not fortifications. Infrastructure for a prior energy system distributed across the planet at sites of maximum geological conductivity designed to harness something that the 19th century energy economy could not afford to have harnessed, built before the industrial transition, repurposed or abandoned during it. Explained away as military construction because military construction is the only category of large-scale architecture from that period that doesn't require us to ask uncomfortable questions about who built it, why, and what they were powering. The uncomfortable question is this. If communities across the planet had access to ground-source distributed energy in the pre-industrial period, what were they using it for? What does a civilization look like that doesn't need a centralized fuel supply? What does governance look like when energy can be owned and sold? What does economics look like when the fundamental scarcity that all industrial capitalism is built on simply doesn't exist? We don't know because we've been given a different history. One where this infrastructure was always military, where the underground chambers serve administrative functions, where the Turek research was pseudoscience, where the timing of its oppression and the timing of the largest private fortune accumulation in human history are unrelated. The forts are still there, thousands of them, still geometrically perfect, still positioned on the same geological formations, the chambers beneath them still documented in fragmentary records that nobody assembles into a coherent picture. The angles of the bastions still pointing down, still directing something toward whatever's below the foundation, still doing geometrically what no military purpose requires. I keep returning to the angles, the precision of them. You don't achieve this precision for decoration. You don't maintain this precision across 2,000 structures on 6 continents for aesthetics. Precision at this scale, this consistency, this geographical distribution, means function. It means someone understood something about what these structures were doing and built them to do it correctly, and built thousands of them and positioned every one of them on ground that the military explanation cannot account for. The economic history we've inherited tells us that energy scarcity was natural, that coal and oil were discovered just in time to power an industrial revolution that was waiting to happen, that the people who built their fortunes on that scarcity were simply in the right place at the right time. The Starfur suggests a different story, one where the scarcity was not natural, where it was constructed, where something that worked was systematically replaced by something that could be owned, and where the evidence of what came before was reclassified, underfunded, buried under administrative silence, and left standing in plain sight across every continent on the planet, labeled military architecture, explained as defense, and never under any circumstances examined in aggregate.